Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 374, and it's side 1, February the 2nd, 1979. This tape today is dedicated to a very, very dear friend who passed away. It's hard for me to do this thing. Art Cherry was a great researcher, a real patriot, organized the unions and the print shops, continued his political work up until the hour he died, wrote letters to the editors, sent letters to various researchers, purchased books, articles, magazines, spread the information, called the talk shows, wrote a letter to the editor every single month in the Palo Alto Times, showed his outrage at social changes that were for the worst and hoped for the better, and worked, as I say, up until an hour before he died. A real patriot and one of my very, very, very best friends. Art died this week. So this tape is for Art, whoever he is. I'm sorry. But I guess he subscribed to these ever since he knew about them for a long, long time. He gave me a lot of the kind of psychological support I needed to do the work I do. I'm going to miss him. So we world watchers will have to continue without him. He'll be in spirit with us. And we need each other. Things aren't very good out there in the world. We need each other. We need people like that. So this tape, 374, is for Art Cherry. I promised you last week that I would review that book by Michael Lebedev called Treason for My Daily Bread, but I was so upset over the death of Art that I really didn't get time to read that book this week, and we'll get into it in the next week or so. One of the things that really ired Art Cherry was listening to KGO and a gentleman, that's a radio talk show in San Francisco, a gentleman named Jim Eason, who got on the air and ranted and raved about the Iranian students causing the fire and demonstration against the mother, the Shah of Iran, at the home there. And Jim Eason was on the air just days at a time talking about these students. Let's get them, let's deport them. They don't appreciate this country and they should obey the laws of our land. And he wrote a letter to Jim Eason. This is in January, about the 20th, complaining about the way Jim Eason carried on with these students. And he also wrote a letter to the Palo Alto Times, a letter to the editor, suggesting that these could have been agent provocateurs, that this would be a way of getting rid of people opposing a fascist regime, is to put in other provocateurs, similar to Hitler did at the Reichstag. He used the Reichstag as an excuse to round up and imprison and kill his critics, the critics of the Third Reich. And Art Cherry realized that there was so much attention at the dinner hour, similar to the SWAT teams killing the 6 SLA in Los Angeles. It was prime time television, and for your dinner hour you saw these fires and demonstrations, and Art felt that before people got so worked up about it, they should consider that we still have a COINTEL program going on. And he was very angry at Jim Eason for ranting and raving about the Iranian students and how ungrateful they were. So on January 24th, 1979, this was written on the 24th, and it was received by Art Cherry on January 25th. Of course, 2 days later, Art passed away. There was a letter from Jim Eason, KGO radio station. Dear Mr. Cherry, I guarantee you this is the last time I will ever write you, and I further guarantee you I will never open any mail from you in the future. You really need help. You're either too befuddled to understand what you are hearing, or you are a deliberate liar. You have misquoted, misrepresented, and lied about me repeatedly. He said, if you cannot document your previous charges against me, your statements will go in the file along with other outrageous charges I have, right? I caution you, any further correspondence from you will go into the trash can unopened, so save your postage. Perhaps you can apply the 13 cents toward professional help to determine why you either misunderstand things or distort things you don't understand. I promise I will never write you again. Goodbye. Jim Eason, January 24th, 1979. A copy of this letter is available for competent psychiatrists to review. Well, Art was both proud and hurt, and as I say, he passed away 2 days later after he got that letter, and he wrote me a letter. I'd been talking to him on the phone every day, and he wrote me a letter January 27th, 1978, and this was written in the evening about between 12:30, and he passed away at 1 o'clock. And in this letter, he refers to Jim Eason and those kind of people who don't understand what he's trying to say about counterintelligence or provocateurs. And he said, as I explained on the phone, Eason dwelt full-time on the Iranian students and lynch mobs for 9 days. Incidentally, Eason wanted to take vigilantes down there and clean up Beverly Hills. And Art said to me, he didn't rant for 5 days, which I thought it was, but it was 9 days, he has in capital letters. And when I get the strength and time, I shall follow up on that. Never ever in my misspent life have I ever kowtowed to a bully, no matter what his superior clout. And he says, it seems as if I've always been understanding and sort of forgiving of terrorized associates and close personal friends, but not with Jim Eason, not with payrollers of genocide and extermination and humankind. No way. Now, this was written, as I say, this is last Friday night, early Saturday morning when he passed away. An hour before he passed away, he wasn't going to kowtow to people like Eason and accept the insults that he gave him and allow the ranting on the radio without being challenged. Just yesterday, February the 1st, 1978, a story was in the San Francisco Chronicle. It was also covered in Eastern papers during the week. The foreign students are hard to keep track of. This is by George Williamson. The spectacle in early January of Iranian students storming a Beverly Hills retreat occupied by the Shah's mother and sister provoked the Carter administration to threatening to deport foreign students who get out of hand. The implied weapon behind the threats was an awesome federal file that could be used to zero in on all foreigners guilty of the slightest violations of their students' visas. But the President and the Attorney General are learning that they promised more than they can deliver. The U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service is not only understaffed and undercomputerized and preoccupied with millions of illegal aliens coming in through the Mexican border, but out of the 500,000 students in this country, maybe 30,000 are Iranians, and they can't keep track of them, and they don't know where they are, and they don't know who they were. So what the major media called Iranian students who were using our universities for higher learning may not have been anything more than what Art Cherry was saying it was a scene to go against students, have sympathy for the Shah's mother, overturn cars, and put on a good COINTEL operation like we saw at the political conventions when the FBI and the military were doing their counterintelligence operations to discredit the hippies and the anti-war movements, and have sympathy for the Shah and show how beastly these unappreciative students are who've been demonstrating against him. Of course, it didn't work the way the game plan went, and the Shah had mingled among the provocateurs, I'm sure, people that really didn't want him. But all that Art Cherry was trying to say on KGO radio and in letters was, don't come to quick judgments, don't work up hysteria against good guys or bad guys, don't get vigilantes on the streets, calm yourself and find out if they really were students or if we are duplicating what happened in Germany in the 30s that brought us to that terrible war. That's all he wanted to know. He wrote letters to the station, he wrote letters to the editor, and now it turns out there is really no way to prove that those were students, and Art was absolutely right. He was right in waiting on your judgment, and he was right in not inciting riots of the right kind, right-wing kind, which was what Eason was doing for 9 days. There has been a paid commercial on Monterey television in the morning yesterday and in the evening and 2 days ago, put on by Mr. Shaw. I'm not sure if it was J. Gary Shaw who wrote the book Cover Up with Larry Harris. Both of those men live in Claiborne, Texas, and I've called Mr. Shaw, but I haven't gotten a response, at least up to the time that I made this tape for you, to see if he's the party who put the ad on. But what the paid ad said on television was the suggestion that the government find out who killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and George Wallace, because nobody is safe in this country. The House Select Committee on Assassinations didn't do their work. There should be a panel of investigators who should demand the truth and present it to the federal government. Now, that's a wonderful suggestion, and Mr. Shaw has written, if this is the same Shaw, it probably is, but I'm not sure. There's another Mr. Shaw who's critical of the Warren Report who lives in the Monterey area, and I'll try and locate him. But the Gary Shaw, who wrote the book Cover Up, has done an excellent job. It's a good book of evidence and facts of conspiracies. But the thing that I want to keep stressing is that there is no need to republish all this information on the ballistics evidence, the medical evidence, the proof that conspiracies took place in killing Officer Tippit, Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, and John Kennedy, or in any of these other assassinations. The only thing that is in agreement is who was behind it all and how did it come down. And there's no use having a panel of people get together unless they're in agreement on how it came. And while I've done extensive work for 15 years into the history of the assassination teams and how they were formed and where they met, and into the international, say the Tsars, the White Russians, the Solidarists, Vasilov's army, beginning back at the end of World War I with the role Herbert Hoover played, his investments in Russia, his alignment with the British government intelligence, forming our OSS with, that was our first spy system, the OSS. The British government helping us form the CIA with Reinhard Gehlen. Unless a panel can get into that history, and so far the researchers I know, except for individuals, just a few isolated individuals such as Lydia Blades, my friend Lydia, and Marge Gibson, well, I can name a handful, 2 or 3, 4 dozen people who are in the history behind the assassinations. But the various researchers that collect the photographic evidence or the ballistic evidence don't meet with us, and they're not interested in the history. They want to stick with the trajectory, which is important, but that's already been solved. If they don't want to go into the history of this phenomena, it will never be solved, and it'll be one more panel. So wherever Mr. Shaw is, whether he's the Shaw from Monterey who just placed the ad, or Gary Shaw, the idea is right to have the panel, but the panel has to tell the whole story. Those of you that have my tapes on the House Select Committee, or you can get them, they're listed on the sheet of available tapes, the criticism of the Assassination Information Bureau or Mark Lane, or my own feelings of what is being covered up, the John Paisley story that we've done something on in the last 2 weeks. These are what I call the bottom line or the top of the triangle, the basis of the conspiracies, or the very top peak, whichever you want it to be, starting from the bottom up or the top down. But unless you go into the areas of the international, Ian Fleming, the British connections, the Canadian connections, Montreal, the Italian connections with Permindex and Clay Shaw, the international trade marts, unless you go into that, you can't solve these assassinations. And most of the researchers are not willing to take the time or energy to study the history of it. And that's the tragedy, because too many people are going to go. Art Cherry knew the history. He understood the Gehlen operation. He understood the way that people are thrown into a genocidal situation and oppressions. And more people have to study history, an overall view of who has been doing the controlling and hurting and the war shaping and keeping us in wars to keep us off guard, and doing it by killing those people who would be opposed to the wars, killing the leaders who would be reasonable leaders, and putting in puppets. that's the state we're in now, and I'll follow up the ad and maybe have more for you next week. And I don't know if it's just a local or it's a national, but we'll keep an eye on it. One of the points that was stated in that ad is that unless we follow the real story behind the assassinations, no public figure is safe from assassinating. And now we go to the very interesting death of Nelson Rockefeller, the vice president, former vice president of the United States. He tried to run for president and never quite got the nomination, was appointed vice president. He was the governor of New York for 4 different terms. Nobody mentions Nelson, the Attica shootout, Rockefeller, where he ordered the deaths and the killings at Attica prison. The obituaries very nicely leave that out, just as when Earl Warren died, they had accolades for all of his public career, but if you look through the obituaries in your newspapers, you won't find mention of the Warren report that he served on the investigation of the death of John Kennedy. Well, Art lived one day after Nelson Rockefeller. I thought that was great. I wish he had lived a little longer to enjoy the rest of the story, but he outlived Rockefeller, and that in itself was a feat. I don't know how much satisfaction it was at that point, but that I'm always told to be careful and take care of myself, and I've given a list of precautions by everybody, including Art Cherry. But even Nelson Rockefeller, with bodyguards and chauffeurs and all kinds of people surrounding him, security systems, died. And of course, the circumstances, again, are unusual, and unusual circumstances seem to happen to political people. Whether it's the Pope, John Paul I, or Nelson Rockefeller, this globe is in a great state of turmoil. I believe it's on the brink of World War III, the Fourth Reich. The power structure is tangling itself at the very highest level, and I think that the awareness of the people, people on the streets, if you've seen the movies of the streets of Iran, the people awakened after all the savant and all the torture and the silence seething inside the people, for better or for worse. Even if they go back to the Middle Ages with Khomeini, it's their choice, or they know what they're doing, or they think they know what they're doing, but at least they're alive. If they don't like what's happening, they can get out again. But they came to life after sitting in their homes and taking oppression for these many, many years, financed by the American government. Well, the first stories, of course, the headlines this week were Rockefeller dies at his desk. He was working at his office at Rockefeller Center. He was working on a book featuring his extensive modern art collection when he slumped over his desk. I'm reading the quotes from the news stories. The truth actually was, the next story came out, that Rocky died in his private offices at 13 West 54th Street in New York City. He had a heart attack while he was working on a book. Then the story finally came out that he died at his Manhattan home, 13 West 54th Street, but it was his townhouse in New York City. The next story was that Rockefeller was pronounced dead upon arrival at 7:15 p.m. at the hospital. Later, they said that he was taken to Lenox Hill Hospital and dead upon arrival at 10:15, and then the Rockefeller secretary later changed the hour, I believe, to 11:30. Rockefeller passed away. I'm bringing this out and quite slowly for you because I want you to think of some relative or loved one that you knew, or someone who was not, say, political in nature, this political, and think of when they died and how they died, either on a skiing trip or at the doctor's office or in a hospital or somebody's home. But how many times do people change the story? When a story comes out that somebody died at that place, it's usually at that place. And when they say he died at Rockefeller Center and he died at 54th Street, there's really quite a difference between a private home and an office, because if there's a possibility that somebody wanted to do away with him at this time, it would be hard to get up the elevator and into the private office where the secretaries and the guards are. It would be more difficult unless he'd been poisoned at lunch or given a dark kind of thing, similar to that umbrella poisoning in England. If somebody wanted to get rid of Rockefeller, it would be hard in Rockefeller Center, but in a home, it's not as difficult to get the home. Well, the first reports were very clear. A normal day at the office. His health was excellent. He had no previous history or serious illness. and everybody was taken by surprise. Medical examinations were perfect, but at age 70, the heart gave out. But an immediate cremation was ordered. The services for the family were supposed to be on Monday, and large public services on Friday. And the usual procedure is to have your family service and then the cremation, and the ashes are laid to rest. But all of a sudden, the radio announced Sunday that a day ahead of time the body had been cremated. And a Dr. Ernest Esikoff told the head coroner in New York City, the same Dr. Michael Baden, who works with the CIA, who testified before the House Select Committee on Assassinations regarding the John Kennedy medical evidence. Dr. Michael Baden should, as the chief man in charge of the county coroners, New York City, should order an autopsy, because the law states clearly in New York City that an autopsy is required unless physical evidence is proven that if a physician has treated that party for a physical condition that was listed as the cause of death before he died, no autopsy is needed. But if the physician has never listed or treated that person, an autopsy is required. So Dr. Ernest R. Esikoff came out and told Dr. Michael Baden that Nelson Rockefeller had a history of heart trouble, that hardly anybody knew it, and his wife never knew it, and his sons never heard of it. But the doctor said because he knew that he had this history of heart trouble, they cremated him without an autopsy. And that's kind of interesting, because it'd be nice to know what day he went to the office to see Dr. Esikoff, what heart tests were administered to him, where are the readings of the heart tests, what did he prescribe for them, why wasn't there any mention to your family? Usually when a man goes to the doctor for a cardiogram, he will tell his wife or family what he has if there's a heart condition. And the New York law states clearly that an autopsy is required if a person dies from some condition that was unknown up to that time of death. And the body was cremated, and then along comes Dr. Ernest Esikoff and says, oh yes, I knew he had a heart condition. Nobody else did. Now the first news stories out were that he only had a security guard and a chauffeur with him when he collapsed. That those were the two people with him. Then all of a sudden the security guard and the chauffeur story faded away, and he was with a woman named Megan Marshak, who called the ambulance and asked the hospital to send somebody over right away. She said, somebody is dying, come quickly, and she gave the address on 54th Street and didn't know, they said, it's an apartment, what apartment number? And she said, no, it's a house, come quickly, it involves a death, and she doesn't mention Nelson Rockefeller. I just wonder if Ms. Marshak knew who she was with. Again, the first stories were that he was working with a researcher, Megan Marshak, who worked with him for 4 years, and that she was 31 years old. Then the next story said that Megan was 21 years old, and if she was 21, then she either did a research with Rockefeller since she was 17, or she wasn't a researcher at all, she'd be in school, and there's a big discrepancy there. Then it turned out that she had worked for the Associated Press in Washington, D.C. radio, Associated Press Radio, which is a known history as a conduit for the Central Intelligence Agency. And if she was 17, I wonder when she was working, so that her age is still left open. There's various ages here and how long she knew him. And the question is, why didn't she give his name, and where were the chauffeur or bodyguard, or was she alone with him at the time that he died and nobody else was there? As I say, the cremation was quick. They had a short service for the cremation where members of the family came, and there was an article in the paper that said, in quotes, a few family members attended the service. Happy Rockefeller, his widow, didn't attend. She's secluded at the estate, in quotes, sad but dignified. She did attend the services the next day when the ashes were put in the ground. Both wives were there. Now, Rockefeller, as Standard Oil, Exxon, owned Creole Oil in Venezuela. That's an affiliate of Exxon, the descendant of Standard Oil. A great deal of their oil money comes from Venezuela. And we know that Jonestown borders right up to Venezuela. Guyana is right next to Venezuela, And George Philip Blakey from Britain, British intelligence, in 1973 was one of the men who's still alive who escaped with Jim Jones' boat, who was in charge of a team who rented the property in Jonestown. One of the conditions of renting that property was that there was walking space, that they'd be close to Venezuela. They were on a river that backed up right to Venezuela. There was a Venezuela boat in the river at the time that these 910 people died, and the news media at the time said, well, they couldn't have escaped because the boat could have picked them up. But being as 110 to 210 are still missing, it could be that they escaped and the Venezuela boat took them away. These people are still missing. Also, Jim Jones had money in 14 banks, including a bank in Venezuela, and there was money involved in banking and also nursing. People went there for medical care, for drugs, for assistance, for medical problems to Venezuela, and if Jonestown was a mind control extension of the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA, Venezuela was a part of it. And the Rockefeller family was very much a part of Venezuela. These are just connections that there's nothing to prove yet. He's only been dead a week. But there also would be other motives for killing Nelson Rockefeller at this time, where Rockefellers have been behind Jimmy Carter. The Trilateral Commission and David Rockefeller handpicked Jimmy Carter for president of the United States, went down to Georgia and said, come on up, we're going to put you in office, and Carter may be the vengeance against the Republicans who lost that year. The Rockefellers were behind the Jimmy Carter nomination and the election. And we have one more year to go before the elections come up again, and one other Rockefeller, John Rockefeller, died July 1978. He was hit by a car on their family estate. We never heard anything more about that, although you think that he would be protected from this kind of head-on collision up in Westchester County. And Winthrop died in 1973. He was the governor of Arkansas for 2 terms. So just as many people have feared a Kennedy clan with John Kennedy and his brothers Joe Kennedy and Robert and Ted taking over the White House of the presidency under the guidance of old Joe Kennedy, there's a lot of people that hate the Rockefellers and the Rockefeller dynasty and the Klan. And if you see how the power structure moves, they're losing a power base here with John, Winthrop, and Nelson out. That leaves David, president of Chase Manhattan, whose working agents have always been Mr. Brzezinski or Henry Kissinger. But I wonder if Kissinger and Brzezinski are serving the Prince Bernhard, Queen Juliana crowd that put Adolf Hitler into power. They are foreigners, German-born, Polish-born, and as we go into the war against the Soviet Union, which is what these people want, putting in the Polish Pope, the Brzezinski hand-picked Pope, and we'll go into that more on the other side of this tape, and now he's touting against the Soviet Union and lining up with China against the Soviet Union. They're getting ready for a war. And the loyalties of Henry Kissinger or Brzezinski to Poland and Germany may far exceed loyalties to the United States. And it even could be that the Rockefellers, if you could believe this, were too moderate for what's going to come down next. Because even though these people, corporations funded Adolf Hitler, they also helped break up Hitler and when World War II was over. While they rearmed the Nazis for the next war, there are levels of anger and desire to get into this next war and into fascism one more time. And while it sounds silly to call Nelson Rockefeller or Cyrus Vance liberal, there is a big split going on in the politics at the highest level, and I would say it's Cyrus Vance and Kissinger and the Nelson Rockefellers versus Brzezinski, Reagan, Ronald Reagan, Paul Assault, Bush, John Connally, and those people that are gunning for World War III. That political clout of the Republicans lining up is like an army of 7 top men. And now Nelson is out, and Brzezinski would work for any one of those men that wants to run for President of the United States. There's another motive for doing in Nelson Rockefeller. He was mentioned by Donaldson, who got 17 bullets in his head in December of '77. That was the allegations of a gentleman and Mr. Altman a long time ago, and Donaldson hasn't surfaced. And he was supposed to have the name of Nelson Rockefeller as involved in the Kennedy assassination. And I feel that Nelson Rockefeller might have been done in because of what John Paisley knows now, the James Angleton connections to the assassination. I'm throwing out names without connecting all the links because there isn't time on this side. I'm just mentioning the links to the Kennedy assassination in general terms. Nelson Rockefeller also wrote a blank check for George de Mohrenschildt, a Nazi spy, a friend of Lee Harvey Oswald's, his CIA contact in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. De Mohrenschildt died before the House Select Committee on Assassinations could call him, but he had to be directly linked to Donaldson and this John Paisley that has disappeared or been killed. So Nelson Rockefeller's name came up with that regard. There would be many motives, and I could go on and cite a few more on why he would be murdered, and we'll talk about them on the other side of the tape. And of course, the mystery woman, Megan Marshak, that is the unknown factor that we also have to go into and see what develops on that story. Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 374, side 2, February the 2nd, 1979. The real answer to what happened to Nelson Rockefeller lies in this Megan Marshak. If she's a typical, as I say, a boiler room girl, whether he even knew her, whether this woman was just called in for the evening, for the hour, to service Nelson Rockefeller, and she ended up with a corpse and didn't know who he was, or whether she was actually working with him on a book, or whether she was sent there from somebody else to do a job, or whether they delayed calling the ambulance to make sure he was dead or till she got dressed. There's a lot of unknown factors here, but a wonderful way to get rid of Nelson Rockefeller, if somebody wanted to get rid of him, would be to have it happen with a woman, because then the news media totally blacks it out in deference for the widow, etc., etc. And the stories say of Chappaquiddick happened to keep Ted Kennedy from running from office. In that case, a woman had died. Well, in this case, Nelson died. But I think there are too many discrepancies in the story of where he died, who he was with, how he died. Now, all of those could be done to save the fact that instead of going home at night, he went to 54th Street, another home, his family was somewhere else, and had a woman and dropped dead. And they dropped dead of a heart attack, and he was caught. That's all. No big conspiracy. The only problem is the immediate cremation of a body, the lack of an autopsy, the fact that nobody knew he had a heart condition, that they can bend the law any way they want, and that Ms. Marshak, as of this date, has not been photographed, seen, or interviewed. If she was not an agent put in there, say, for purposes of getting rid of Nelson Rockefeller, if she was actually a friend of a family or just a woman caught in a circumstance, I'm sure the news media would find her and photograph her and have some press interview. After all, this is a prominent family, and she was with Nelson Rockefeller when he dropped dead. And there's been a total news blackout, and there was a news blackout from the time he died. It was an unstory, and unstories sometimes have to be looked into. And when this Mr. Shaw had this paid advertisement that nobody is safe if we don't investigate assassinations, he's perfectly right, and I don't think that there should be no autopsies and cremations so rapidly of public figures who do affect the course of the history, and they're going to affect your life, the air you breathe, and the world that you live in many, many ways that too numerous to list here. Well, one of the staunchest supporters of the Rockefellers, one of the big mouths of history, one of the most rotten journalists, James Reston of the great New York Times, had his usual words to say for Nelson Rockefeller that were syndicated Wednesday, January 31st. But he wrote them after the death of Nelson and before the name Megan Marshank came into the news, and or else he wouldn't have written them. So I want to share these with you just to show you how the news media is so maudlin and idiotic and sickening. Share a couple of sentences. He begins, "A worker to the end, Rockefeller never achieved his dreams." And then he says, this is James Reston, "It should probably remember that Nelson Rockefeller died at his desk on Friday night after almost everybody else had gone home for the weekend. He was a worker, a yearner, a builder to the end." You know, this great American hero. "He was not working when he died on the struggles, achievements, or disappointments of his political life, but on the consoling influence of art, beauty, and personal life." I don't think James Reston knew how right that was, and he was working on his personal life. And he has a quotation of Nelson Rockefeller, who said, in quotes, "I think there's so much tension and pressure in the world that one gets tired and short-tempered, and if you can come back at the end of the day to an environment of beauty that has an important effect on one's tranquility and sense of peace, and to me, beauty and love are very closely related. Love is by far the most powerful force in the world." End quote. Well, love it was, and it was such a powerful force, he keeled over dead. But he had a wife and 5 children that he left in 1963 and married happy, and she gave up her 4 children to her husband and left custody of them and didn't raise them, so they had abandoned. This was 9 children between them, and then they had 2 more children of their own. There is one more subtle possible motive. There are many for the reason that Rockefeller could be done at this time, and that has to do with the large story in San Francisco of Rockefeller buying on the West Coast, investing money in property and working with a certain team and alliance in the San Francisco politics that built this controversial Pier 39 that is now under investigation, this large shopping center down on the wharf down there, as opposed to the Italian mafia organizations headed, well, I call them the Intertel group versus the mafia group, the same kind of conflict that took place in Las Vegas when the Hughes organization moved in and kicked out a certain element of organized crime to take over the turf there. The Alioto area that former mayor of San Francisco controlled, he had shipping lines that went bankrupt. There's lawsuits involved in that. And there is a power struggle of various people in that city, Ben Swig and Cyril Magnan and Pearsons that built this Pier 39, as Mr. Simmons, versus the Alioto group, the Fisherman's Wharf territory. San Francisco is in a great state of turmoil. Dan White owned property, didn't own, leased his potato restaurant from Pier 39. That's the man that killed Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk. And Dianne Feinstein became the mayor of San Francisco because these other 2 people had been murdered. And she works with the Magnan, Ben Swig, Charles Gaines, chief of police, Rockefeller interests in San Francisco. So there's a conflict, a war going on at the highest levels there for covering, in simple words, so I call words, the turf of the city. And I had predicted that some more big people would be killed in this conflict. And of course, nobody in the major media, nobody at all is mentioning the possibility of the Rockefeller investments in San Francisco or the Rockefeller investments in Jonestown territory next door, the Venezuela connections. These things have to be charted out very carefully, but San Francisco, most of the people, the home base from San Francisco for Jonestown, if it was a government experimental place or a place for training assassins and so forth, with its escape routes in Venezuela, had to have some connections to Rockefeller investments in Venezuela. There's a can of worms here that I'm not going to delineate right down to the nth degree, but I did predict that there would be deaths of some more people involved in the San Francisco scene, and because the Rockefellers had invested on the West Coast, this just recently bought the largest turkey farm in the United States up here near Santa Rosa, I believe, the Rockefellers. So some of them began moving west, and this may have something to do with why Rockefeller's control is diminished, and now they're down to brother David Rockefeller. There was also a cousin that died, another Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller, Nelson D. Rockefeller, died 2 days before Nelson in New York died. And this Nelson Rockefeller was a friend of Art Cherry's. He died at a veterans hospital in Palo Alto January 24th, 2 days before Nelson Rockefeller died. Just another one of those coincidences. Art knew this Nelson, and the other Nelson was his first cousin, I believe. And just before he died, his last letter to me, Art Cherry asked me why I killed both Rockefeller brothers, suggesting, of course, in jest, that these people were done in. And the coincidences continue, but one died at this end, one cousin, and the other one died in New York City. I'm sure that many of you saw the program Operation Mind Control that was on ABC nationwide. It got a lot of publicity this week, and they showed different centers where mind control experiments were done. They mentioned in Montreal, McGill University there, and Tulane University, and they had a tower of Berkeley campus, and they just briefly said at universities, and Boston Hospital, and there was a scene of Dr. Delgado's famous bulls being controlled by electrodes. For those of you who haven't seen that broadcast, I have covered a lot of that in various tape cassettes, and it wasn't new information for those of you who have followed my tape, so I won't go over it again. One interesting point that they did make on this particular broadcast was that James Angleton of the Central Intelligence Agency, who was the agent in charge of counterintelligence, was very anxious to use hypnosis on agents, and they showed the Manchurian Candidate and the attempts of the Central Intelligence Agency to create persons who could do political assassinations and have their memories erased. And if you have the two tapes I did last week on John Paisley and the week before, I mentioned that James Jesus Angleton headed the assassination teams and was chief of counterintelligence, and that he was the man not only who worked with John Paisley since 1948, but hinted in 1974, when he officially left the CIA, about the assassination of John Kennedy, that he wasn't privy to who shot John. But there were hypnotists involved in the various assassinations that Angleton has been involved in. At Jack Ruby's nightclub, there was a man named Billy Del Mar, a hypnotist, who could have had control of Jack Ruby and coaxed him to do the shootings. Billy Del Mar was never called as a witness. He fled Dallas after the assassination of John Kennedy. And also, Jack Ruby was in the touch with David Ferry from New Orleans and the assassination teams. And it was Jack Ruby who right away was very proud that he had shot Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who was the alleged assassin of John Kennedy, because he believed that he would be a hero and everyone would love him. He was told that. And he was quite proud of what he did until he realized that he was trapped. And of course, there's been many references to the mind washing and erasing of Sirhan, and that he would like to go back to the scene of the ambassador to reconstruct what happens, because he doesn't know what happened. And he's been under deep hypnosis ever since Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And Arthur Bremer shot George Wallace and has this silly grin on his face, and has never been studied in terms of being hypnotized to get to Laurel, Maryland, to the shopping center to find out where George Wallace was going to be, and then to be taken away as a zombie. James Earl Ray's head seems clear on this matter. He doesn't seem to be hypnotized like the others. Reverend Dumke was on radio and television this week talking about Patty Hearst and her release, and she was released yesterday from the federal prison. And in my article, The SLA is the CIA, I believe that I was the first person in the country to publish the fact that Patty Hearst had been given a substance that she called a pill when she made that tape to her parents, and that this pill could change and alter her entire personality and put her under a victim of mind control. And in the article I wrote called The SLA is the CIA. Some of you have it, and if you don't have, you can write to me and order it. It's $1 plus the postage, which is now about 30 cents for the postage. In that article, I talked about the UCLA Institute for the Study and Prevention of Violence, and that the basis of trying to analyze the members of the SLA who are so potentially violent would be reason enough to continue that UCLA school that I was worried about, and that I believe then was the basis for the experimentations down in Jonestown. What I wrote in 1974, in the summer of 74, in this article was, in quotes, "A carefully guarded secret has been the massive brain experimentation and hypnosis programs taking place in prisons and mental hospitals for the past 15 years. And I referred to different medications which were administered, double doses were given for no reason, which caused distinct changes in personalities. Over the past year, I wrote, I have been accumulating evidence of mind-altering methods and how they pertain to the past political assassinations. The U.S. has financed psychosurgical experiments in Boston by Dr. Mark, Irvin, and Sweet. That's the surgery that I referred to last week on the tape of Leonard Keeley. I said they're now spreading around the country, these doctors, with plans that exist to turn large masses of the population into zombies to be used for future slave labor and kamikaze war troops. Prisoners are the experimental scapegoats. And in this article I referred to Dr. Delgado, funded by NASA, and that's the space agency that brought over Nazi doctors after World War II, and Navy intelligence, and their purpose is to control behavior through implanted electrodes. This is being done at the present time at Vacaville Medical Facility, a Tuscadero hospital in California, and I have a quotation there that was in the congressional record of Dr. Delgado talking about physical control of the mind, that man does not have the right to develop his own mind. Now, in 1974, in my article, the SLA is the CIA, or why was Patricia Hearst kidnapped? I want to repeat what I said, because the same institutions that I was fighting in 73 and trying to expose in 74, it seems, were the institutions that moved down to Jonestown. And what I said, there was a double purpose for the experimentations that were going on. A, turn large masses of the population into zombies to be used for future slave labor. And the second thing would be the kamikaze war troops. After the 910 people were killed in Jonestown, there was talk of Terry Buford and other people that assassins were out loose, and we figured out that there are at least 120 minimum to 210 that are still out loose. There was talk by the very persons involved that these people were trained assassins, and there was a doctor from Tulane University that went down there right away to be with those so-called defectors or survivors from Tulane, that it was important in the electrode and LSD experiments, who said that various assassins have been brainwashed and that they were trained down in Jonestown. Now, one of the new books out on the melons, there's a new book out on the Mellon family, talks about their bauxite in Guyana and bringing persons, bring the bauxite up through Louisiana to various locations in the United States. But the nice thing about it was that there's long hours there, and they could have enclosed camps and keep the workers going. There was no control on the workers, and use slave labor in the bauxite mines, thus making the profits greater, so that they could train slave laborers who still were unaccounted for in Jonestown and assassins at the same time. And the two things that I was writing about in 1974 are just those things that were happening down in Jonestown in 1978. And what really bugs me about the Patty Hearst case is that when it became obvious that she was going to get out, and that there were links of the SLA to the Central Intelligence Agency, links that I discussed in two tapes on Leo Chern and a Little Green Book, and other tapes, as I say, are available in the past for you. What really bothers me is that as the evidence came in of who was behind the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, and I had met Reverend Dumke, who's been her advisor and friend, and people from the Patty Hearst Committee came down to the house for information. when the evidence was really strong on who was to blame for creating the whole SLA, then everybody who is part of this counterintelligence network responsible for it or close to it came in and became her saviors. Ruth Stapleton was with her the night before Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence and went down to see her and visited with her. And then Patty Hearst's fiance said, "We'll name our first baby Jimmy Carter Shaw." Senator Hayakawa said, "Release her," even though he's tied up with the highest level of counterintelligence from Britain and international intelligence, and has been all of his life. Hayakawa said, "Release Patty Hearst." Charles Bates of the FBI said, "Release Patty Hearst," even though it was a COINTEL program under the direction of the FBI. And the Hearst family had the names of Dothard Perry and a Mr. Lewis, and men from the CIA, from both the CIA and FBI, who knew where she was all along, and the Pentagon knew where she was, and they were responsible for this charade. And they are agents. Emily William Harris know also their background in Indiana, Bloomington, Indiana, with the narcotic and intelligence squads. And the Charles Bates got into it, Hayakawa, Ruth Stapleton, and D.A. Browning, appointed by Richard Nixon, said, "Oh, she's served enough." When it became obvious that the heat was on Patty Hearst's story, and the evidence was coming in loud and clear on both the mind control of Donald DeFreeze and the CIA connections of Colston Westbrook and Chris Thompson, and the whole nucleus that formed the SLA, just like they formed Jonestown, this white entourage, among the Berkeley scene of a extremely capable, well-trained intelligence operation. When that began to become evident to more people than, say, just Mae Brussell, then all of these people got in on the free Patty Hearst. Come on, let her out, Jimmy, let her out. Not that she shouldn't be out, but Hayakawa and Stapleton and Bates and Browning and all of them. And the result is that Patty Hearst comes out and thanks all of them for helping her get out, and says, "We'll have a military wedding because we can have seclusion." So a woman that was somewhat free before the kidnapping, who could make some decisions on her own, right or wrong, was taken away, kidnapped, altered, and then brought back to the straight life. Her husband is a policeman. He brought her a bulletproof vest to wear when she left the jail, the prison, federal prison. He's very expertise at karate, and they have a dog to protect them, and they can be married at a military location. But if this was, in fact, an intelligence operation, if she can provide any information about the Harrises, and even Reverend Dumke promised me and never gave me the Nazi connections to Emily William Harris and the Nazi indoctrinations that Patty gave her, maybe I'll be able to meet her. She's written me a letter and thanked me for all that I've done. But if it is a high-level plot, and if she still knows too much, she's married to a cop who will take care of her, but she'll never be immune. There isn't any kind of a vest or suit or car that will protect her any more than Nelson Rockefeller or Pope John Paul I. There's no bodyguards or anybody that will protect Patty Hearst. I felt that all along that her protection was in asking through the courts how the SLA was formed, and if she was bumped off then, she'd be bumped off for a reason. But now she's going to fall into the arms of all the right-wing people who hushed up when she was kidnapped, who ignored her, the media that put her down and played up the kidnapping and not the brainwashing. And now she is going along with the idea that they are her saviors, which is okay, but I wouldn't want to be in her shoes, because if the whole thing doesn't come out, she can't be safe. And I think that she'll settle for just ending it and not exposing the roots of it. And the roots of the SLA are what need to be told, because the SLA was the baby of Jonestown, and Jonestown is just another monster before some other tragedy takes even more than 910. The similarities between the SLA and the Jonestown story are tremendous, and they're not coincidental. And if you study the SLA, get my article, which is book length, and read it carefully, and then take the research that I'm doing on Jonestown, you can see the overlays of the same people, the same doctors, the same motives that I stated then taking place now. And what I said when John Kennedy was killed was that if you didn't investigate John Kennedy's assassination, all other political elections could be run by the bullet and blackmail. And that's what is happening, and that's what that Mr. Shaw was saying on the ad. If you study any single one of the assassinations well, the seeds are planted for the next. And if you pass them up, you lose the opportunity to have your electoral system without these constant manipulations of murders. And you also lose the opportunity for a free life and free choices, because Jonestown was an experiment that's going to affect all of us. And if we don't investigate it, like we didn't investigate the SLA, and I asked 1,000 provocative questions in that article that nobody could answer and nobody cared to answer. Even the people that read it might have found it interesting and ordered more, but they didn't address themselves to the question. So what comes down next is another tragedy, and then on top of that, we get another tragedy. Mr. Baldwin, 94 years old, founder of the Civil Liberties Union, was on Good Morning America, and he was interviewed by David Hartman yesterday, and they asked him, what was the biggest disappointment in your life? And he said the biggest disappointment in his 94 years was the Soviet Union-Nazi pact just prior to World War II. He said the communists let him down, and that they made a pact with the worst dogs in the world, the Nazis, and then there was no peace, and the Nazis just had time to get stronger, and the war broke out full blast. And that was the biggest tragedy in his life. And I think you should read the headlines and watch very carefully two big forces, in addition, three big forces of fascism building up. One, Khomeini in Iran, and the other is Jimmy Carter signing pacts with Mr. Tang. The headline saying China reiterates its warning on threat posed by the Soviet Union. That goes into that warm game plan of United States arming up with China against the Soviet Union. China and the United States signing their agreement literally to gang up against the Soviet Union. This is a very dangerous thing, and it's something you should watch, the way it's building up and the way the same corporations, I have a list of the corporations that put on that affair at Kennedy Center the other night, the same corporations that funded Adolf Hitler funded the event for the visiting gentleman from Chinaman who is now scolding the Soviet Union. At the same time this is taking place, Pope John Paul II, I call him the Pope from I.G. Farb and Auschwitz, is down in Mexico, and the throngs are there. The throngs in Iran, similar to the adoration Adolf Hitler had, and throngs down in Mexico. And this Pope, this article's the adoring crowd turns out for the Pope. Pope urges the Latin bishops to speak out against injustice. Another headline from the Examiner News, January the 28th, Pope cheered as he warns of Marxists. And there's a little contradiction there. He's worrying about the poor people, and he's visiting the Indians. The San Francisco Chronicle, January the 30th. Pope visits the poor Indians of Mexico. And the other paper on the 24th, he speaks out about injustice, and then he begins his anti-communist talk. The Pope warns you about the Marxists. If the Marxists were in Mexico, those people would have a house, a job, a medical place, facility for them, employment, health, without the narcotics, without organized crime, without the Central Intelligence Agency. And the Pope is there to speak this double talk. Be careful of Marxists, but I'm sorry because you're poor. Pope John Paul was analyzed in the Washington Post, an article by Sarah Gilbert. John Paul III has shown a sterner militancy towards Marxism than did his namesakes. And they said several Italian observers said that the former Archbishop of Krakow ought to have called himself Pius the 13th. Every week there are new people that begin taking these tape cassettes, and if they have already heard the information, I don't like to repeat it. And that's why I have to refer the new listeners back to tapes 362, 363, and 364. Those are the numbers that refer to how Pope John Paul II was selected. This Pope is down in Mexico, and another story over the wire services came out, Associated Press. Pope tells the Latin bishops to stay out of politics. He says that his address to the people will be on social justice spiritually, not politically, and this is important. He told the bishops, don't depict Christ as a political figure involved in a class struggle. The idea of Christ as a political figure doesn't tally with the church's catechesis. And he told them to beware of that. Don't think of Christ as political. I disagree with him entirely, and I think it's important in terms of political assassinations to realize that most of what we call assassinations are, in fact, political acts. There's a book that came out a few years ago called The Spear of Destiny by Trevor Ravenscroft, and it begins with a very good point, which I want to share with you in light of what the Pope is trying to tell these people down there. It refers to the Gospel of St. John and the piercing of Christ with this spear that went through his ribs. The name of this soldier was Gaius Cassius, Gaius Cassius. He attended the crucifixion as the official Roman representative for the proconsul Pontius Pilate. For 2 years, Cassius had followed the activities of a certain Jesus of Nazareth who claimed to be the Messiah, but he was undermining the authority of the Roman occupation of Israel. The Roman centurion watched the legionnaires carry out the execution of Jesus Christ, and like them was impressed by his courage. But Annas, A-N-N-A-S, the aged advisor to the Sanhedrin, decided that they should put a spear into Jesus to prove that he was nothing but a heretic, a potential usurper of their own power, of their own political power, of the Roman political power. So they petitioned Pontius Pilate for the authority to break the limbs of the crucified men and put this spear through the ribs of Jesus Christ. And the spear did penetrate Jesus, and the book is about that spear and where it went and what happened to it. But the fact is that the Romans were doing nothing but exploiting other people's territory, other people who were not warmongering. Israel wasn't armed in those days, and they were minding their own business in that country way back when. And the Romans were off conquering, just like this country conquers Iran. They say, we want your oil. Here, put in the Shah for 25 years. Here's the Savak. Here's the weapons. Here's the torture house. Let us pump our oil. Political assassinations have been around for a long, long time. And the way to end them, I think, is to expose the profits that are gained by those people during the murders. And if we don't expose them, then the killings keep going on and on. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. I'll be back with you next week, so stay well and happy, and we'll be back together next Friday. Art Cherry used to have champagne every night, 2 glasses of champagne when Avis came home from work. So this song is for Art Cherry.